My name is Vanessa Holt. I'm 29 years old. 6 weeks before my wedding, my mother sat my fiancé down and told him I'd abandoned a secret baby years ago. A twin I supposedly gave away and never spoke of. He believed her. He almost called off the wedding. I had no idea any of this happened until the night of our rehearsal dinner, when a young woman walked through the doors holding a folder of documents that would prove exactly who had been lying, and it wasn't me. 40 guests watched my mother's face go white as the truth she'd buried for years finally introduced itself. If you've ever been rewritten by your own family into a villain in someone else's story, stay with me. Like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read everyone. Before I tell you what happened at that dinner, you need to understand exactly how my parents built the lie that almost cost me everything. Before I continue, if this story is already making your blood boil, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read every single one. Let me know if you're on Team Vanessa, because what happens at that rehearsal dinner is going to leave you speechless. I need you to understand something about my family first, though. We looked normal. We looked perfect, actually. 2 loving parents, a beautiful home, a daughter getting married to a wonderful man. On paper, we were the family everyone envied. But paper doesn't show you what's underneath. My name is Vanessa Holt. I'm 29 years old. I grew up in Lakewood, Colorado, in a 4-bedroom house on a cul-de-sac where every lawn was mowed on Saturdays and every family went to the same Presbyterian church on Sundays. My father, Gordon Holt, was a regional sales director for a medical devices company. My mother, Patricia, stayed home until I was 12, then went back to work as a dental hygienist. On the surface, we were the kind of family that got picked to appear in the church newsletter. I was an only child. That mattered later in ways I couldn't have imagined at the time. My parents were controlling in the way that gets mistaken for devotion. My mother picked my clothes until I was 16. My father reviewed my report cards line by line, not to celebrate the A's, but to interrogate the 1B+. Every decision I made, my college, my major, my first apartment, went through a committee of 2 people who genuinely believed, that they knew what was best for me better than I did. I went to Colorado State, studied marketing, graduated in 2019. I moved to Denver, got a job at a mid-sized ad agency called Brightline Creative, and slowly, carefully started building a life that was actually mine. It wasn't easy. My mother called 4 times a week asking why I hadn't come home for Sunday dinner. My father sent unsolicited advice about my 401k, my apartment lease, my choice of friends. But I was out. I had my own address. That felt like something. In 2021, I met Marcus Bellwether at a mutual friend's birthday party. He was 31, an architect at a firm downtown, kind in a way that felt unfamiliar to me. The kind that didn't come with conditions attached. We dated for 2 years before he proposed in April 2024, on a hiking trail in Golden, Colorado, with the whole Front Range spread out behind him like he'd planned the view specifically to make the moment unforgettable. He had. My parents loved Marcus. Or at least they loved what Marcus represented. A stable, employed, handsome man who would presumably keep me close, keep me manageable, keep me inside the world they'd built for me. My mother started planning the wedding before I'd even picked a date. She had opinions about the venue, the flowers, the guest list, opinions she delivered as facts rather than suggestions. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't know for months, was that somewhere underneath that enthusiasm was something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with flowers or venues. Here's what you need to understand about my mother, Patricia Holt. She did not like to lose control of a narrative. If she couldn't control an outcome, she controlled the story around it instead. I'd seen her do this my whole life in small ways. Reframing an argument so she came out looking reasonable, describing a family conflict to relatives in a way that made her the victim. I thought I understood the scope of what she was capable of. I did not. Because 29 years earlier, in March 1997, something had happened that I knew nothing about. Something my mother had buried so completely that even I, her only child, had no idea it existed. And when that buried thing started threatening to surface, when it became clear that keeping it hidden might not be possible forever, my mother didn't come clean. She didn't tell me the truth. Instead, she built a different story. A safer story. A story where the secret wasn't hers. A story where the secret was mine. She decided, somewhere in the 18 months before my wedding, that if the truth was going to come out, it would come out with my name attached to it instead of hers. And she started laying the groundwork months before I ever noticed anything was wrong. By the time I found out what she'd done, she'd already told my fiancé. She'd already told him I had a secret. She'd already told him I had a daughter I gave away and never spoke of. A twin, born the same year I was supposedly born, hidden my entire life. None of it was true. But my mother had never needed something to be true. She only needed it to be believable. Looking back, I can point to the exact moment things started shifting, even though I didn't understand what I was seeing at the time. It was August 2024, 4 months after the engagement, at my parents' house for Sunday dinner. My mother had been oddly quiet all evening, picking at her food, checking her phone under the table in a way she normally scolded me for doing. My father kept steering conversation away from wedding planning whenever it came up, which was strange because 2 months earlier he'd been the one asking about caterers. At one point, my mother excused herself to take a call in the other room. I heard fragments through the wall. A name I didn't recognize. Diane. A tone in my mother's voice I'd never heard before, something close to panic dressed up as calm. When she came back to the table, her face had the composed blankness she wore whenever she was hiding something. I asked if everything was okay. She said, "Just an old friend," and changed the subject to whether Marcus and I had picked a photographer yet. I didn't think much of it then. I had no reason to. September 2024. My mother started asking strange questions. Not about the wedding, about my childhood. "Do you remember much from before kindergarten? Do you remember the Fairview house, the one before this one? We'd moved when I was 3, something I knew only because she'd told me, not because I remembered it myself." I said no, obviously not, I was a toddler. She nodded like that answer satisfied something specific, some private test she was running, and didn't explain why she'd asked. October 2024. My father started drinking more at family gatherings than I'd ever seen him drink. 2 beers turned into 4 into 6. Once, late in the evening, slightly slurred, he said to me unprompted, "Your mother did what she thought was right, Vanessa. Back then. You have to understand the times were different." I asked what he meant. He blinked like he'd surprised himself by saying it out loud, then said, "Nothing. Forget it. I'm tired," and went to bed. I didn't forget it. I just didn't have anywhere to put it. November 2024. My mother's sister, my Aunt Renata, called me directly, which she almost never did. We weren't especially close. She lived in Tucson, saw us twice a year at most. She asked carefully whether my mother had talked to me yet. Asked about what? There was a long pause on the line, and then Renata said, "It's not my place, honey. Ask your mom," and got off the phone quickly, almost too quickly, like she regretted calling at all. I did ask my mother. That evening on the phone. I said, "Aunt Renata called. She said you needed to talk to me about something." "What is it?" My mother's voice went sharp and fast. "Renata talks too much. There's nothing." I don't know what she's referring to. Then, before I could push further, she said she had to go, dinner was burning, and hung up. That was the pattern for the next 2 months. Fragments. Half sentences. Doors that opened a crack and then slammed shut before I could see through them. Every time I tried to ask a direct question, I got deflection, redirection, or my mother's specialty, turning the question back on me until I was the one apologizing for having asked it in the first place. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing, was that during those same months, my mother was having a very different set of conversations. Not with me. With Marcus. It started small, according to what I learned much later. A comment here. A comment there. Over Thanksgiving, November 28, 2024, my mother pulled Marcus aside in the kitchen while I was in the living room with my father, ostensibly to ask him about wine pairings for the reception. What she actually said, according to Marcus's account months later, was this: "I just want you to know, whatever happens, whatever you hear, Vanessa's had a hard past. Harder than people know. I hope you'll be patient with her if things come up." Marcus told me later he'd found the comment strange but hadn't pressed it. He assumed it was a mother being protective, maybe referencing something like anxiety or an old relationship. He didn't ask follow-up questions. That was the opening my mother needed. December 2024. Christmas Eve. I wasn't in the room for this conversation either. Marcus and my father were in the garage, ostensibly looking at my father's old tools, something Marcus had shown polite interest in months earlier and now deeply regretted mentioning. My father, 3 beers in, said something that Marcus would describe to me later as confusing, but I let it go because it was Christmas and I didn't want to make things weird. What my father said, as close to verbatim as Marcus could remember it: "You're a good man, Marcus. Good for Vanessa. She needs someone steady. Someone who won't judge her for things that happened before you two even met." Marcus asked what he meant. My father laughed it off, said something about kids these days and their complicated pasts, and changed the subject to a table saw. 2 separate conversations. 2 separate parents. Both planting the same seed in different soil, hoping it would grow into something specific by the time they needed it to. I had no idea any of this was happening. I was 29 years old, working full-time, managing wedding logistics, dealing with vendor contracts and seating charts, and my mother's opinions about tablecloth colors. I was exhausted in the ordinary way brides are exhausted. I had absolutely no framework for understanding that my own parents were quietly constructing a narrative about me behind my back, one conversation at a time, months before the wedding, months before I would ever learn what they were actually protecting. By January 2025, 5 months before the wedding, the groundwork was already laid. Marcus had heard enough fragments from enough people that when the full story finally arrived, when my mother finally decided the moment was right to tell him everything, he wouldn't ask why nobody had mentioned any of this before. He would just believe her. February 14, 2025. Valentine's Day. I remember the date exactly because Marcus had made dinner reservations at a restaurant downtown, and I was getting ready in my apartment when my mother called asking if she could stop by, for just a minute, to drop off a wedding gift she'd found for me early. I said sure, thinking nothing of it. What I didn't know was that she wasn't coming to my apartment. She was going to Marcus's office. Marcus told me the full story 3 weeks later, after everything had already unraveled. My mother had called him that morning, said she needed to speak with him privately, said it couldn't wait, said it was about me and it was important he hear it from her before the wedding got any closer. He'd agreed, confused, assuming it was something logistical. Some seating chart crisis. Some caterer issue. She met him at a coffee shop 2 blocks from his office at 11 a.m. He described her as visibly nervous, twisting a napkin in her hands the entire conversation. She started by saying, "I need to tell you something about Vanessa's past. Something she's never told anyone, something I've protected her from having to explain her whole life. I'm telling you because you're about to marry her, and you deserve to know before you do." Then she told him this, that when I was 17 years old in the spring of 1997, a year notably before I was even born, though Marcus wouldn't do that math until much later, I had given birth to a twin. That there had been complications during a pregnancy she claimed I'd hidden from everyone, that I'd secretly delivered a daughter and given her up, unable to cope with the shame, unable to face what people would think. She said I'd never spoken of it again, that I'd built a wall around that period of my life so complete that I might have genuinely convinced myself it hadn't happened. She said she was telling him now, before the wedding, because she'd recently learned the daughter, my supposed daughter, had been trying to make contact and she was afraid the girl might show up unannounced at some point during the wedding festivities, and she didn't want Marcus blindsided. She cried while she told him. Marcus said the tears seemed real. I believe they were. I think my mother had spent so long building this story that some part of her had started to believe pieces of it herself. Marcus sat with that story for 11 days without telling me anything was wrong. He told me later he didn't know how to bring it up, didn't want to accuse me of something so enormous without giving me the benefit of the doubt first, kept waiting for an opening, a natural moment, something that never came because I had no idea there was anything to address. During those 11 days he started pulling away. Small things at first. He stopped initiating physical affection the way he used to. He got quiet during wedding planning calls, distracted, present but not really present. I asked him twice if something was wrong. Both times he said he was just stressed about work. On February 25, 2025, everything came apart. We were at my apartment going through the final draft of the guest list, when Marcus set down his pen and said without any warning, "I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me." I said okay, confused by the shift in his tone. He said, "Is there something about your past you haven't told me?" Something about... He paused for a long time. A daughter. I genuinely did not understand the question. I asked him to explain. And he told me haltingly, painfully, everything my mother had said at that coffee shop 11 days earlier. The pregnancy at 17. The secret daughter trying to make contact. As he spoke, I felt something in my chest go cold and then hollow, an emptiness that spread outward until I could barely process the words coming out of his mouth. I told him it wasn't true. Not a single word of it. I told him I'd never been pregnant in my life, that I could prove it, that this was insane, that my own mother had apparently sat across from him and told him a complete fabrication about my body, my history, my entire life, and he had believed her instead of asking me. He said quietly, "Why would your own mother make that up?" I didn't have an answer. Not then. I only knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't true, and that not having an immediate explanation for why my mother would invent something so specific, so cruel, so detailed, made me look worse in that moment, not better. The lie had a story. The truth was just my word against my mother's, and my mother had cried when she told hers. That night was the worst night of the entire engagement. Marcus didn't leave, but he didn't stay close either. We sat on opposite ends of the couch until nearly 2 a.m., him asking questions I couldn't answer because there was nothing real underneath them, me growing more frantic with every passing hour because I could see, in real time, the foundation of my relationship being eroded by a story I hadn't even known existed until that evening. Finally, around 2:15 a.m. I called my mother. She didn't pick up. I called again. Nothing. I texted her. "Marcus told me what you said to him. Call me back right now." No response. She didn't respond for 4 days. When she finally did call on March 1, 2025, her explanation was worse than the silence had been. She didn't apologize. She didn't retract the story. She said in a voice that was somehow both defensive and wounded, "I did what I thought was best, Vanessa. Some things are better left in the past. I never meant for it to come out this way." I asked her the only question that mattered. "Is there a twin?" There was a long pause on the line. And then she said something that would take me another 3 months to fully understand. "That's not a conversation for the phone. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever had someone in your own family rewrite your history to protect themselves, and hand you the blame for something you didn't even know existed? If that's you, comment rewritten below. You're not alone. And stick with me because that phone call, that's not a conversation for the phone, was the first thread in something much bigger than a lie about a twin. It would take me months to pull that thread all the way to the truth. Keep watching. This story gets a whole lot worse before it gets better. March 2025. I didn't wait for my mother to decide when it was time to talk. 2 days after that phone call, I drove to my parents' house unannounced, sat down across from both of them at their kitchen table, and said I wasn't leaving until I had an answer. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. My mother stared at the table for a long moment and then finally she told me the truth. Or what I would later learn was the beginning of the truth. She said that in September 1996, she'd given birth to twins. Me and a sister. She said the pregnancy had been complicated, that there had been financial strain, that my father had just lost his job at the time, that they'd made a decision she described as impossible, and the hardest thing I've ever done, to place one of us for adoption through a private agency in Denver. She said she'd kept me. She said she never told me because she didn't know how, because every year that passed made the silence feel more permanent, more impossible to break. I sat at that table and felt the entire architecture of my life rearrange itself in real time. I had a sister. Twin. Somewhere. My whole life. And instead of telling me, instead of ever at any point in 29 years, giving me the chance to know that, my mother had let it sit buried until it threatened to surface on its own, and then rather than come clean, she'd taken the shame of what she'd done and handed it to me instead. She told my fiancé I had a secret daughter because the actual secret, that she had given away one of her own children and hidden it for 3 decades, was one she could not bring herself to say out loud to the man about to become her son-in-law. It was easier, apparently, to make me the villain of a story than to be the villain of her own. I asked her name. My mother said she didn't know. Said the adoption had been closed, records sealed, that was the arrangement, that was supposed to be the end of it. I didn't believe her. I still don't fully. But I also understood sitting there, that pushing further in that moment wasn't going to get me anywhere. My mother had spent 29 years building a wall around this. She wasn't going to hand me a doorway just because I'd finally found the room. I left that house and didn't speak to either of my parents again for 6 weeks. Marcus and I spent those 6 weeks in a strange, careful rebuilding process. I understood why he'd believed my mother. A mother crying in a coffee shop describing something so specific and painful is a hard thing to doubt on instinct. But I also needed him to understand that the failure wasn't really about the lie itself. It was that he'd sat with it for 11 days without giving me the chance to respond to it. We went to couples counseling starting in April 2025, a therapist named Dr. Allison Farrow in Denver, every Tuesday at 6 p.m. It wasn't easy. There were sessions where I was so angry I could barely speak, and sessions where Marcus cried more than I did, apologizing for not coming to me immediately. But we did the work. Slowly, deliberately, we rebuilt something that felt sturdier than what we'd had before because now it had actually been tested. While we worked on the relationship, I started working on the mystery. In April 2025, I ordered a DNA testing kit from Ancestry DNA, mailed it back within the week, and started the agonizing 6-week wait for results. While I waited, I did what anyone with an internet connection and a decades-old family secret does. I started researching Colorado adoption law from 1996, private adoption agencies operating in the Denver metro area during that period, and mutual consent reunion registries where biological relatives could register to be matched if the other party registered too. I found an agency called Bridgeway Family Services, which had operated in Denver from 1988 to 2003 before closing. I called them in early May. A woman named Carol, who'd worked there in an administrative capacity decades earlier and now ran a small nonprofit helping adoptees search for records, told me that Bridgeway's old case files had been transferred to the state archive when the agency dissolved, and that under Colorado law I, as the biological sibling, had limited rights to request information, but that registering with the state's confidential intermediary program was my best option. I registered on May 9, 2025. Then I waited. May 22, 2025. My DNA results came back. I remember sitting on my apartment floor, laptop open, scrolling through a list of genetic matches, searching specifically for anything flagged as a close family match, a sibling-level match. And there she was. A name, Diane Reyes Whitfield. Estimated relationship, identical twin. Match confidence, 99.9%. Diane. The same name I'd overheard my mother say on the phone 8 months earlier, back in August 2024, the conversation I hadn't understood at the time. My mother had known this name the entire time. she'd been in contact, or at least aware of contact being attempted, for at least 6 months before she ever told Marcus a single word about any of this. I sat on that floor for close to an hour just staring at the screen at that percentage at that name before I did anything else. I sent a message through the DNA platform that same night. I kept it short. I told her my name, my age, that I'd just learned about her existence 3 months earlier, that I had no idea what she knew or didn't know, and that I would understand completely if she needed time, or wanted nothing to do with any of this. She replied 9 hours later at 6:47 a.m. on May 23rd. Her message was 4 sentences long. She said she'd known about me for 2 years. She said she'd been trying to make contact through the adoption registry since 2023, and had recently, in the fall of 2024, managed to get an intermediary message through to our biological mother, my mother, asking to be connected. She said our mother had responded exactly once, and the response had been, "This isn't a good time. Please don't contact this family again." That was the conversation my mother had walked away from in August. That was the call. That was the beginning of everything she'd spent the next 6 months trying to bury under a different, more convenient lie. Diane and I talked every day after that. Video calls, texts, long voice messages sent back and forth across time zones. She lived in Seattle, worked as a labor and delivery nurse, was married with 1 daughter of her own. We looked at each other through screens for the first time in our lives and saw our own faces staring back, 29 years apart from the moment we'd been separated in a Denver hospital neither of us could remember. By June 2025, 6 weeks before my wedding, Diane and I had made a decision. She wanted to meet our parents. Not privately. Not quietly on their terms in their kitchen, where the truth could be managed and softened the way it always had been. She wanted to meet them in front of everyone. The wedding was set for August 9, 2025, at a vineyard outside Boulder. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for the evening of August 8, at a private event space attached to the venue. 40 guests, close family and the wedding party. A night that was supposed to be gentle and celebratory before the actual ceremony the next day. I told Marcus everything about Diane by early June, the moment I'd confirmed the DNA match myself. He was, by that point, fully back in my corner. Not just apologetic but actively angry on my behalf once he understood the full shape of what my mother had done. He was the one actually who first said out loud what I'd been circling for weeks without letting myself land on it directly. "You know she's going to try to control this too, right? However this comes out, your mother is going to try to be the one who controls how it comes out." He was right. And that was exactly why, when Diane told me in June that she wanted to meet our parents in person, and specifically wanted to do it somewhere my mother couldn't quietly manage or minimize, I didn't try to talk her out of it. We debated the ethics of it for weeks. I want to be honest about that. Part of me worried that showing up at the rehearsal dinner, of all places, was needlessly dramatic, that it would hijack an event that was supposed to be about Marcus and me. But the more I sat with it, the more I understood something important. My mother had already hijacked my engagement. She'd done it in a coffee shop in February, quietly, with tears and a story that wasn't true. Specifically because she knew I wouldn't have the chance to respond to it in real time. She'd chosen the terms of that fight. She'd chosen to strike where I couldn't immediately defend myself. I wasn't inviting Diane to the rehearsal dinner to create a scene. I was refusing for the first time to let my mother be the only one who got to choose when and how the truth arrived. In July 2025, I called Diane and asked her directly, "Are you sure you want to do this at the dinner in front of everyone rather than privately first?" She said something that has stayed with me since. She said, "Vanessa, they had 29 years of private conversations to tell the truth, and they chose to lie instead. I don't think they've earned a private conversation anymore." I didn't argue with her. We didn't tell my parents anything. That was deliberate. I wanted my mother to walk into that room the same way Marcus had walked into that coffee shop back in February, unprepared and about to hear something that would rearrange everything she thought she understood about how this story was going to end. I did tell a small handful of people beforehand, people I trusted completely and needed on my side that night. Marcus, obviously, who'd known since June and had been quietly steadying me through the entire process. My maid of honor, Priya, who I'd known since college and who agreed without hesitation to help make sure Diane got seated at the right table without drawing attention beforehand. And my Aunt Renata, the same aunt who'd called me back in November, who I now understood had known some version of the truth for years and had been trying, in her limited, cautious way, to nudge me toward asking the right questions. I called her in July and told her everything. She cried on the phone. She said she'd wanted to tell me for years and had never had the courage, that my mother had sworn the whole family to silence back in 1996 and nobody had ever broken it. She asked if she could be there when Diane arrived. I said yes. I did not tell my father, though in hindsight I believe he suspected something was building. In the weeks before the wedding, he'd started being unusually gentle with me, unusually present, almost as if some part of him understood that a reckoning was coming and didn't know how to stop it or prepare for it. Diane flew into Denver on August 7th, the day before the rehearsal dinner. We met at the airport. I want to tell you what that felt like, watching a woman who shared my exact face walk through the arrivals gate, but I'm not sure I have the words for it even now. We stood there for a long time before either of us said anything. She was taller than me by maybe an inch. Same eyes. Same slight gap in our front teeth that neither of us had ever fixed. We'd spent our entire lives apart and somehow still recognized each other on sight. She stayed with me and Marcus that night. We stayed up until nearly 2 a.m. going over what she wanted to say, what I wanted to happen, what we both understood might go badly. She told me she wasn't there for revenge. She said she was there because she'd spent 29 years being a family secret, and she was done being managed by people who had never once, in 3 decades, chosen honesty when a lie was more convenient. The next evening, August 8, 2025 at 6:45 p.m., Diane walked into the rehearsal dinner holding a folder of documents. Adoption records, the DNA match report, and the message history proving exactly when and how my mother had learned about her, and exactly what my mother had chosen to do instead of telling the truth. The rehearsal dinner was held in the Vine Room at Hollow Creek Vineyard, a long space with exposed beams and floor-to-ceiling windows facing the mountains. 40 guests. Round tables draped in cream linen. String lights overhead. My mother had spent months on this room specifically. The flowers, the place cards, the seating chart she'd insisted on controlling down to the last detail, the same way she controlled everything. I arrived at 6:15 p.m. with Marcus. My parents were already there, greeting guests near the entrance. My mother in a pale blue dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion, glowing with the particular satisfaction of a woman who believed she had successfully buried something forever. My father stood beside her, quieter than usual, a drink in his hand he hadn't touched. Dinner started at 6:30. Toasts were scheduled for 7:15. Diane's flight timing, her ride from the hotel, all of it had been planned to land her at the door at exactly 6:45, mid-appetizer, before anyone had had enough wine to be either loose-lipped or unreasonable, but late enough that the room was full and settled. At 6:44 I felt my phone buzz. A text from Priya, she's outside. I looked at Marcus. He reached under the table and took my hand. At 6:46 the doors at the back of the Vine Room opened and Diane walked in. I want to describe what that looked like from the outside because I've had it described to me by at least 6 different people since. A woman who looked exactly like the bride. Same face, same build, same walk. Appearing in the doorway of a rehearsal dinner where nobody had mentioned a twin was coming, because nobody had known there was a twin to invite in the first place. The room didn't go silent immediately. It happened in a wave, table by table, as people's eyes followed the direction other people were staring, until finally, within maybe 15 seconds, all 40 guests had turned toward the door and gone completely quiet. My mother turned last. I watched her do it. I watched her face move through confusion, then recognition, then something that dropped so fast and so completely it looked almost physical. the color draining out of her, her hand finding the back of a chair to steady herself. "Diane," my mother said. Just the name. Barely audible, but the room was silent enough that everyone heard it. Diane walked toward the front of the room, toward my parents' table, holding the folder against her chest. She stopped about 6 feet away. "Hi, Mom," she said. Her voice was steady in a way I found almost unbearable to listen to, because I knew how much it had cost her to make it sound that way. "I don't think we've ever actually been introduced." My father stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "What is this? Vanessa, what is going on?" I stood up too. "This is my sister," I said. "Diane. My twin. The one you gave away in 1996 and never told me about. The one Mom lied to Marcus about back in February, except the story she told him wasn't true. There was no secret pregnancy of mine. There was no daughter I gave away. There's just Diane. A person you decided was easier to erase than explain." My mother's voice came out thin and fast. "This is not the place, Vanessa. This is your rehearsal dinner. We can talk about this privately tomorrow after." "You had 29 years to talk about it privately," Diane said. Her voice didn't rise, didn't shake. "You had a message from me 8 months ago on the intermediary registry asking to connect. Your exact response was, and I quote, 'This isn't a good time. Please don't contact this family again.'" She opened the folder and set a printed page on the table in front of my mother. "I brought a copy, in case you didn't remember exactly what you wrote." My mother didn't touch the paper. Her eyes were fixed somewhere past Diane's shoulder at the room full of watching guests. "You don't understand the situation we were in back then," she said. "We were young. We had no money. Your father had just lost his job. We made the only choice we could make." "I'm not here about the choice you made in 1996, Diane said. "People make hard choices. I understand that better than you think. I work in labor and delivery. I've watched a lot of families make hard choices. I'm here about the choice you made 8 months ago when I finally found you and you told me to go away. And I'm here about the choice you made in February, when instead of telling your own daughter the truth, you told her fiancé a lie designed to make her look like the one hiding something." She looked at me. "You made Vanessa carry your secret as if it were her shame instead of yours." My father sat back down heavily, his face in his hands. Around the room I could see people's expressions shifting. My mother's sister Renata, sitting near the front, was openly crying, not from shock I understood now, but from something closer to relief. Marcus's parents, seated at the next table, were frozen, uncertain whether to look away or keep watching. Aunt Renata stood up. "Patricia," she said to my mother, her voice cutting cleanly across the room. "Tell them what you told me. Tell them you swore this whole family to silence for almost 30 years because you couldn't bear for anyone to think less of you." My mother's composure finally cracked completely. She sat down hard in her chair, hands pressed over her face, and for a long moment nobody in the room said anything at all. I walked over to where Diane was standing and took her hand. "I didn't bring her here to humiliate you," I said to my mother, quietly enough now that it was just for the people nearby, not the whole room. "I brought her here because you spent my whole life deciding what I was allowed to know about my own family, and I am done letting you make that decision for me. Tomorrow I'm getting married. Diane is going to be there. He's my sister. That's not a negotiation." My mother didn't answer. She sat there, still covering her face, while the room around her slowly, carefully began to exhale. The rest of the rehearsal dinner did not go back to normal. Nobody expected it to. Priya, ever practical, quietly signaled the catering staff to hold the toasts, and instead the evening dissolved into something quieter and stranger. Small clusters of guests talking in low voices, my father sitting alone at the head table for almost 20 minutes before he finally stood up and walked outside, and my mother eventually retreating to the restroom, where Aunt Renata told me later she stayed for nearly 45 minutes. Diane and I sat together at a table near the back with Marcus, and for the first time all evening in the middle of all that wreckage, We actually got to just be sisters at a dinner talking quietly, while around us the fallout of 29 years of silence rearranged itself in real time. My father found me around 8:30 p.m., outside near the vineyard's stone patio. He looked older than he had that morning. He didn't try to defend what had happened. He said, "I should have told you a long time ago. I let your mother make that decision for both of us, every single year, and I told myself it wasn't my secret to tell. That was a coward's excuse." He asked if he could meet Diane properly, not as a confrontation, just as an introduction. I walked him back inside. He shook her hand, and then after a moment he hugged her, and I watched my sister cry for the first time since she'd walked through that door. My mother did not approach either of us again that night. The next morning, August 9, 2025, I got married. Diane was there, seated in the second row next to Aunt Renata. My mother attended, sat through the ceremony in near silence, and left the reception early around 8 p.m. without speaking to me. My father stayed the entire night. At one point during the reception he pulled Diane onto the dance floor for a few minutes, an image I have a photograph of now framed on a shelf in our living room. In the weeks after the wedding, the family fractured in ways that were still settling months later. My mother initially tried the same tactic she'd used for decades. Minimizing, reframing, describing the rehearsal dinner to relatives who hadn't been there as Vanessa causing a scene right before her own wedding, conveniently omitting the 29 years of context that had led to that scene in the first place. But this time the story didn't hold because there were 40 witnesses, and because Diane had brought documentation, and because Aunt Renata, finally freed from 30 years of enforced silence, was no longer willing to help manage the narrative on my mother's behalf. Renata told the extended family the truth plainly at a family gathering in September. Several relatives who'd been kept in the dark for decades reached out to me directly afterward. Cousins and uncle, people who said in various ways that they'd always sensed something was being hidden but had never known what. My relationship with my mother has not recovered, not really, not yet. We speak occasionally, brief and careful conversations, mostly logistical. She has never fully apologized, not to me, and as far as I know, not to Diane either. What she has offered a handful of times are versions of regret that always seem to circle back to how difficult the situation was for her, rather than what it cost the two daughters she split apart to manage that difficulty. My father has done better. He calls Diane every other week now. He's driven to Seattle twice to see her, met her husband, met her daughter, his granddaughter, a fact he mentioned to me on the phone with something close to wonder in his voice, like he was only now beginning to understand what he'd missed. Marcus and I finished the couples counseling we'd started in the spring, and kept going for a few months after the wedding, just to make sure the foundation was solid. It is. He tells people now when it comes up, that the hardest and most important thing he ever did in our relationship was sitting across from me after that rehearsal dinner and saying out loud, "I should have believed you the first time before there was ever a folder of documents to prove it." I believe he meant it. I still believe it now. It's been almost a year since that rehearsal dinner. I want to tell you where everyone landed because I think the ending matters as much as the confrontation did. Diane and I talk almost every day now. Not because we're making up for lost time in some frantic, desperate way, but because it turns out we actually like each other, independent of the circumstances that brought us together. She flew back to Denver for Thanksgiving 2025, and again for my birthday in March. I've flown to Seattle twice. Her daughter, my niece, calls me Aunt Vanessa now, and the first time she said it, I had to leave the room for a few minutes to compose myself. We are, in every practical sense, building the relationship we should have had from birth, just 29 years behind schedule. We don't talk about that gap much. We're too busy filling it. Diane still works labor and delivery at a hospital in Seattle. Last spring she told me something that stayed with me. She said that every time she helps a new mother make a difficult decision about her baby's future, she thinks about the version of that decision that gets handled with honesty, and the version that gets handled with secrecy, and how differently those two paths ripple out over decades. She's not bitter about it. She's oddly generous about it, actually more generous than I think I could manage in her position. She says our mother was young and scared and made a choice a lot of women in 1996 were pressured into making. What she can't forgive, she told me once, isn't 1996. It's every year after that, when honesty was available and safety was available, and our mother chose neither. My father and I have grown closer than we've been in years. He comes to Denver for dinner every few weeks now, just the two of us sometimes, which never happened before any of this. In June 2026, he told me he and my mother had started living somewhat separate lives under the same roof. Not divorced, not officially separated, but distant in a way he described as finally honest, even if it's not comfortable. He said the rehearsal dinner didn't break their marriage. He said it just stopped letting them pretend the cracks weren't already there. My mother lives largely the way she always has, in the same house, attending the same church, telling, I assume, some version of this story to whoever will still listen that centers her own difficulty rather than the two daughters she separated. I've made peace mostly with the fact that she may never fully reckon with what she did. Some people spend so long protecting a story about themselves that they lose the ability to see any other version of events, even when the evidence is sitting on the table in front of them in a folder held by a woman who shares your exact face. I don't hate her. I want to say that clearly because I think it would be easy to expect this story to end in a clean, satisfying severance, and it hasn't. It's ended somewhere messier and more honest than that. A relationship reduced to its bare minimum, careful and distant, but not entirely gone. Some doors you close all the way. This one, for now, I've just left slightly ajar. Marcus and I are genuinely happy. We bought a house in Golden in the spring, not far from the trail where he proposed. Diane and her family are coming to visit next month, her first time seeing it. I've already picked out which room will be hers when she stays. I used to think the worst thing that ever happened to me was almost losing my fiancé to a lie I didn't even know existed. I understand now that the actual story was never really about Marcus or the wedding or even the lie itself. It was about a sister I didn't know I had, who showed up in a doorway holding proof and refused finally to let silence win one more year. If this story taught me anything, it's this. Secrets don't actually protect the people who keep them. They just move the weight of the truth onto someone else's shoulders quietly without asking permission. My mother spent 29 years believing that silence was the same thing as safety. It wasn't. It was just a debt, collecting interest, waiting for someone brave enough to finally call it due. Diane didn't walk into that rehearsal dinner for revenge. She walked in because she was done being managed. And somewhere in that room full of 40 stunned guests, I stopped being the daughter who absorbed my mother's shame, and started being the sister who chose the truth instead. If you've ever been handed a secret that was never yours to carry, I want you to know something. You're allowed to put it down. You're allowed to hand it back to whoever it actually belongs to. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Real people, real families, real reckonings. And remember, some doors don't stay closed forever. Sometimes the truth just needs someone brave enough to walk through them. Thanks for listening.